Just a few seconds ago, you saw this video on your screen and decided in a moment that maybe this would be of benefit to you. And then you subsequently moved your arm or finger or mouse to that screen, clicked it, and here you see my face. Now, you may be regretting that decision at this point, but the reason you could do all of those things in order is because of your nervous system. Hey everybody, this is Organized Biology, and today we're going through a comprehensive overview of the nervous system, which literally makes your body go, think, feel, experience, all those things coordinated by the nervous system. So today we're going to divide it up into 4 main sections. Number 1, I'm going to tell you the functions of the nervous system, very important. After that, I'm going to talk about the functional unit, the neuron, the cell that actually does the functions for you. And then we're going to talk about how the nervous system is organized within its structures. Finally, we're going to put it all together, and I'm going to give you a great example of how you actually experience some sort of sensation and how you actually respond to it. So let's get started. First off, the functions of the nervous system. Number 1, one of the main goals of the nervous system is to bring in what's called sensory information. This can come in a variety of different ways. It can be sunlight. It could be smells or scents you smell in the air. It could be the sense of pressure on your skin. All of these things are some form of stimulus, some sort of information that your body is going to bring in, but then once that occurs, you have to process that information. So that's step number 2, processing the sensory information. So in these moments, you are determining, hey, is this an important stimulus? Can I just ignore this? Or should I really be aware of this? All of that occurs in the processing mechanisms of your nervous system. And the third function of the nervous system is actually coordinating some sort of response to what you just processed. So we call that coordination of what's called a motor response. This is when you are actually altering your body's physiology, the functioning, what it's doing, okay? So this is a really important part, is coordinating that motor response to change your body in some way, shape, or form. Now, why do we do these 3 functions with the nervous system? The whole goal of the nervous system, you guys, you need to understand this, is to maintain what's called homeostasis. Homeostasis simply means a stable set of internal conditions. So for example, let's think about this real quick. Let's say you walk outside on a really hot summer day. Your body will sense that heat, right? It'll sense that your body is getting too hot, and that's actually dangerous for you. So in that process, it will process it within the nervous system and decide, hey, we need to cool the body down, right? So what will it do? Well, it will coordinate a motor response to then tell the sweat glands in your skin to start secreting sweat, thus lowering your body temperature. So this is a great example of how we're putting all these things together, bringing in information, processing it, and coordinating the response to keep our bodies in homeostasis. Wonderful. So that's the main functions of the nervous system. You could also include things like thinking and higher level reasoning and memories and storing them. All of those things also occur in your brain, which is a part of the nervous system. But for anatomy and physiology, this is the framework you want to remember. Awesome. Now, what actually does this process? Well, in your body, you are made of cells. Those are the functional units of life. You have about 30 trillion cells, like skin cells, muscle cells, bone cells. But in this case, we're talking about the nervous system. In the nervous system's cell, its functional unit is the neuron. Now, the neuron is very similarly shaped to do these functions. Check this out. So first off, let's look at this neuron cell. It can be really big, by the way. It could be, honestly, up to 3 feet long. So these are the longest cells of your body. Some of them are, and some are very, very tiny, just micrometers long as well. So they're varying in shape. But they will all have this type of general structure. Number 1, we see these little branches coming off, kind of like little feelers, right? And these are called dendrites. Dendrite literally means branch, and what the dendrites do is they receive stimuli / information. So whenever the neuron is going to detect some stimuli, it's going to come in and usually communicate with the dendrite. Okay, this could be a stimulus like a mechanical stimulus like pressure, right? It could also be maybe a chemical. So maybe if you're tasting something, the chemical's binding to a spot on the dendrite, okay? So some sort of stimulus is going to hit the dendrite, all right? Now, once it does this, this cell body called the soma is going to receive, in a way, some of that information. Now, if you haven't watched my video on action potentials, I will link it right here. This is actually how the neuron will process information through stimuli and send the signal. Really helpful. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but what will happen is once it receives that stimuli in the cell body, we're going to start gaining this sort of excitation or inhibition. It's going to stimulate the neuron or it's going to inhibit it. In this case, we're going to say, hey, we're going to stimulate it to send some sort of a signal. So what will happen is, in the cell body, we're going to accumulate positive charges, okay? And when we accumulate positive charges, what will happen is those positive charges will flow down the cell all the way to the end, all right? Now, this is really important. This flow of charges down this end is called an action potential. Think of the action potential of the neuron as the signal the neuron is sending. And you see how the long branch of the neuron is getting this signal sent down it. This long branch that comes down is called the axon, okay? So this is a structural axon, and it's sending the action potential, the signal down that axon, a flow of positive charges. I remember they both start with A. The axon sends the action potential. Really helpful to remember. Now, I'm going to get back to these little rectangles here in a second, but at the base, here's what I want you to remember. Once this action potential reaches what's called the terminal bud of the axon, we have a bunch of circles here. They kind of look like chocolate chip cookies, almost like mint chocolate chip because it's kind of like green. And what will happen is these little vesicles, these are little capsules inside the cell, will fuse with the outer part of the axon when the action potential reaches there. Now, inside of these vesicles, all of these chemicals will be released into this space when that signal is sent. These chemicals are called referring to the neuron, transmitter, which usually refers to sending some sort of information, to transmit information, okay? So it's a neuron communicating through the neurotransmitters. Now, what are these neurotransmitters? They're simply chemicals that can do one of two things. They can either stimulate a target cell, or they could inhibit a target cell. They could do either one. It just depends on the neuron. Some neurons will send stimulatory neurotransmitters. Some will send inhibitory neurotransmitters. No matter what, that neuron will only send one type of neurotransmitter, okay? And what will it communicate with? Some sort of target cell. This cell could be several different things, you guys. This could be another neuron. It could be some sort of muscle cell. It could be some sort of gland, could be other organs, etc. Okay? So depending on the neuron, it will communicate with a different tissue type, a different organ, a different cell, okay? You following so far? Hopefully. Now, I missed something here. Really important. This is a key point of all anatomy, physiology, biology. I have this chemical being sent into this space called a synapse, important term. The synapse is just the space, usually between two neurons. And in the synapse, we have the neurotransmitters. But in order for this target cell to actually receive the information and change its function, it has to have a receptor. So the target cell must have receptors to actually grab those neurotransmitters in order to make some sort of response, okay? So those neurotransmitters bind to the receptors, target cell alters its function so that something happens, so that homeostasis can be restored. Wonderful. Now, that is the neuron. I skipped those rectangles. Now, what are these rectangles? Well, these are called myelin sheaths. Myelin sheaths. I like to relate myelin sheaths as like the insulation of a wire. Whenever you look at a wire, you actually are looking at the insulation, like the little black wrapping around, but the wire's inside. Now, what this does, both for wires, in our case, like computers, and also in neurons, does two things. Number one, it will speed up the signal, okay? Why would that be beneficial? Well, I told you that some of these cells are literally 3 feet long. So we've got to speed up the signal in order for that signal to be sent in a proper, efficient amount of time, right? So what happens here is called saltatory conduction. Once these positive charges get to what's called the axon hillock, it's basically where it branches down and narrows down in the neuron, what will happen, I don't know the physics of this, but those charges, the positive charges of the action potential, will literally leap to both those little nodes of Ron-VA. So these are called the nodes of Ron-VA. It's like they're hopping. So instead of going the whole length of the neuron, instead it's only going the small little distances that are in those nodes. Isn't that amazing? So we're speeding up the signal is number one. And number two, it's just for general protection so that the neuron's axon does not get damaged. Very important. However, I told you that some of these neurons are 3 feet long, right? But some of them are only like 1 micrometer long. So do you think we need myelin for those neurons that are really, really, really short and close together? No. So these short distance signals will actually lack myelin, whereas the long distance signals will have myelin. And what's interesting is you've probably heard of these terms before, but never knew why they're called that. If they are myelinated, this region will look white. That's where we get the term white matter. You've heard of like white and gray matter of the spinal cord. The white matter is all the neurons' axons that are really long and they contain myelin. Okay, so I want you to remember that the long distance signals are the white matter. Awesome. Whereas if they lack myelin and they're shorter distance signals, this is going to appear gray. And like I said, these are short distance signals. All right? So real quick, in the brain, the gray matter is actually along the outside, the cortex, and the white matter is more inside. Whereas in the spinal cord, the gray matter is actually on the inside of the spinal cord, and the white matter is on the outside. Once again, it's just dealing with, are they doing long distance signals here or short distance signals here? Awesome. So now, let's get into the brain and the spinal cord. These two structures are the major players of the nervous system, okay? They're kind of like the CEO of the nervous system. And that's why they are called the central nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And these are like the major players, the overseers of the nervous system, okay? Everything has to run through them, okay? Key points. Now we can also divide the nervous system into another branch, and that's going to be called the peripheral nervous system. So I'm going to erase this a little bit to give myself some space. So the peripheral nervous system is called the peripheral nervous system because periphery means around the outside, right? And the peripheral nervous system kind of exists outside the brain and the spinal cord. Now, there are two main branches to the peripheral nervous system, okay? The first one we're going to talk about is the sensory division. And the other one will be called the motor division. Okay? Now, sensory division consists of sensory neurons. Makes sense, right? So when we're talking about sensory neurons, we're talking about one of these guys, right? One of the neurons, and it's going to send its signal towards the brain or the spinal cord. Okay? Really key point there. So since they're sending signals towards the central nervous system, towards the brain and the spinal cord, this is called an afferent pathway. Afferent usually means that it's sending it towards a major structure, all right? So the afferent pathway, what would that actually look like? Well, the neurons would sit kind of outside the brain and the spinal cord. It could sit in your skin, in your muscles, in your organs, and they'll have those little dendrites again. And they're going to detect some sort of stimulus, depending on what they are, and they are going to send their axon, their signal, towards the spinal cord, or if it's higher up, maybe it'll send the signal towards the brain. Okay, it just depends on where it's located. So for example, sensory neurons in your eyes would send them directly back to the brain, whereas sensory neurons maybe in your arm would send them to the spinal cord, which will eventually get up to the brain. Okay, but either way, these sensory neurons send signals towards the brain and the spinal cord, and then the other division of the peripheral nervous system will be the motor division. But before we get there, remember, we've got the sensory branch to bring in sensory information, but then we have to process it. So I'm going to ask you this. Where do you think the processing is actually going to occur? Well, where's it going first? The brain and the spinal cord, right? So key point, in the brain and the spinal cord, this is going to consist of what's called interneurons. These are neuron-to-neuron communication that is going to actually process the stimuli. Very key point, okay? So once the sensory information gets here, now we have to process it. Maybe we have to send a signal up to the brain to actually perceive what that stimulus is, and we'll get to that with our example. But just know for now, it's going to process the information, all right? And then, last step, coordination, remember, of motor output. That's where the peripheral nervous system with the motor division is going to come in. So once again, after it's processed, now we need to have some sort of motor output, okay? And this is going to be coordinated by motor neurons. Makes sense, right? And these are neurons that are going to communicate with different tissues of the body to change their functioning, okay? So, how is it structured? Well, this motor neuron cell body, otherwise known as the soma, which we saw over here, right, is found in the central nervous system, okay? So the cell bodies will actually lie in the brain and spinal cord, but in this case, they're going to send signals, action potentials, away from the central nervous system, okay? This is called the efferent pathway, making some sort of effect on tissue, okay? So what it would look like is, say there's a neuron, a motor neuron originating in the brain or the spinal cord. It's going to come out and talk to some sort of other structure. Maybe it's going to be the heart. Maybe it's going to be a skeletal muscle, okay? Just depends on what we're going to affect with this motor neuron, all right? Now, with these motor neurons, there's a couple subdivisions, and they might confuse you a little bit. The first subdivision of the motor branch is called the somatic branch of the peripheral nervous system. Now, the somatic motor branch deals with neurons that can stimulate skeletal muscles. Okay, so this makes sense now. So the somatic motor neurons, those are the neurons that are actually sending their signals to your skeletal muscles whenever you move, whenever you talk, so that those muscles can contract and move the way you want them to. That's so cool. So that's where the somatic branch comes in. However, there are certain tissues that you can't control voluntarily or consciously, but they are being stimulated and inhibited. So for example, right now, if you've just eaten a meal, perhaps your stomach's probably contracting a little bit, and maybe you just went for a run, or you're going to go for a run right after this, and your heart rate starts speeding up. So those organs are stimulated, right, in certain cases without you realizing it. It happens automatically. In this case, it's called autonomically, because this is the autonomic branch of the motor division. Now, this is going to deal with involuntary control of many organs and tissues, okay? Basically just clusters of cells, okay? Involuntary control, it happens automatically. And the two subdivisions of that are the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch. This is kind of a complex topic, guys. Sympathetic neurons are going to talk to organs in such a way that it primes you for fight or flight. I'll say that again. These sympathetic neurons are going to alter your organs functioning so that you can fight something or run the heck away from it. Okay, so I'm going to write here, sympathetic is your fight or flight response. Okay, so they're going to be triggered during your fight or flight response, and it's all in. When you're in this stress state, your sympathetic neurons will have overarching control of a lot of different organs, okay? On the flip side, when you're calm and resting, your parasympathetic neurons are taking charge, because these are considered your rest and digest neurons, okay? But what's fascinating, guys, is both of these neurons communicate with the same tissues. So for example, both sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons talk with your heart, okay? So in sympathetic, so if these guys are stimulated and they're sending their signals to the heart, what do you think they'll do to your heart? Well, it'll probably speed it up and increase the contraction, right? Strengthen the contraction so you can run away, pump your blood through your body so you can run away from that tiger that's trying to eat you, right? Whereas parasympathetic, you're just sitting there relaxing, eating your food, right? They will take over when you're calm and it'll actually slow down your heart rate, okay? Decrease the contractions. So I like to think of the sympathetic and parasympathetic as kind of like an angel and a devil on your shoulder. The devil is like fight or flight, whereas the angel's like calm down, you're relaxed. And it's like a teeter-totter. When one is stimulated, the other's not. And when the other's stimulated, the other is not, all right? So keep that in mind. They communicate with the same tissues, but they exert opposite effects. Awesome. So these are the major branches of the nervous system. Now let's put it all together. Voila, so here we go. Here's what's gonna happen. You feel a spider crawling on your right hand, and you decide to shake your right hand to get that spider off. How does the nervous system help you here? Let's follow the neurons, all right? So first step, here's your itsy bitsy spider crawling on your skin. And in your skin, you have sensory neurons, right? And their dendrites will detect the spider there and decide to send the action potential towards the spinal cord, specifically towards about your thoracic vertebrae. As it comes up your right arm, it'll enter into a spinal nerve around here into the spinal cord. Awesome. Well, now we have to interneuron it, right? We've got to process this information. So what's going to happen is in the spinal cord, we will have interneurons that we're going to communicate with. And we're going to send these signals up to the brain, specifically in the thalamus, which is the sorting center at the base of the brain. And this neuron in the brain, interneuron, is going to then communicate with the cortex of the brain. And this is where most of your processing happens. Okay, so this is when we're actually processing and we are now consciously aware of the spider on our skin. So until that point, we had no idea. This is that sensation, but now we're perceiving it. So now what do we want to do? Well, we want to move our right arm muscle to get that darn spider off of us, right? So what's going to happen? Well, we are going to send a signal from the motor cortex of the brain, and we are going to send it down the spinal cord, and we're going to communicate with a motor neuron down here. So I should have drawn this one in red because it's an interneuron. And this motor neuron is then going to communicate with the skeletal muscle to help it to contract. All right? So what did we have here? Well, we had our sensory neuron sending it up, interneuron processing it. Now we're sending another neuron down and out to talk to the muscle, the motor output, to actually make this muscle contract. So this is the motor neuron. And he sent his signal that way. So you see the sensory is that afferent pathway, and then the motor is that efferent pathway. Wonderful. But at the same time, you probably felt relatively stressed. Your heart rate probably increased. How did that work? Well, when we got into the thalamus of the brain, what likely happened is this guy was like, whoa, you're about to die. So I better send a sympathetic neuron out to the heart. So now we've got a sympathetic motor neuron communicating with the heart and speeding up its contractions, okay? All of that happened because you processed the threat, had the fight or flight response to the sympathetic neuron, and now we are speeding up the heart rate, okay? Increasing its contractions. And you probably felt kind of stressed and sweaty, all because of that sympathetic response. Now, I have one really cool fun fact that you need to learn before you go. But before I tell you that, please, if this has been helpful to you, like and subscribe to the video. And I appreciate your support. It helps me make great videos so that you can learn and be successful in whatever you choose to do in the medical field. But now, let's talk about that fun fact. Now, when I drew this out, this was our right side of the body, right? So we have the spider on the right arm and we feel it. But what side of the brain actually perceived this? The left side of the brain. Okay, why? Well, because when this sensory neuron entered the spinal cord, it crossed over to the other side and then went up to the brain. And then, which part of the brain actually initiated the motor output to move the muscle? The left side of the brain. That motor neuron crossed over and then moved out of the right side. That's called decussation, crossing over. So interestingly, that's why the left side of the brain feels and moves the right side of the body. Hey, this has been Organized Biology. Thank you so much for watching.